Hello, Internet Magic Man here, and it's been a long time since I've done anything on my personal channel, since I'm involved in another of other YouTube channels for websites, but I wanted to start putting together some content for something that's become a bit of an obsession of mine recently, and that is Final Fantasy, the trading card game. Now, those of you that know me from other channels know I am a huge Final Fantasy nut. Have been since the early NES days, and Final Fantasy XIV is something that I just absolutely indulge in every single day. Now, about a year plus ago, the Final Fantasy trading card game was released worldwide, and that included, finally, the United States. Previous to that, there was the Final Fantasy Chapter series, which was a trading card game available primarily in Japan. Never made its way over here, and while you can still find those cards for collection purposes, effectively that game was discontinued and replaced with Final Fantasy the Trading Card Game, or, as I'll refer to it from here on out, FFTCG. Now, when it came out in the States, I started collecting it just as a Final Fantasy collector. I had had experience in other trading card games, the big 2 or 3 out there. I'm sure everybody's dabbled in, at least to some extent, and I was no exception, playing other games like Magic the Gathering since I was like 15, 16, 17, somewhere in there. And then teaching my boys how to play it as well. Now my daughter can whoop both of their asses now that she's old enough and has learned how to play too. But I didn't play FFTCG when it came out. I simply collected the cards. I wanted complete standard sets and foil sets of every opus as they came out. And I did so. I completed those sets, and up until about Opus 5, nobody in our house ever played it. Finally, one of my sons and I decided we were going to try it out. We were looking for a new game anyway, and we had boxes of duplicate cards downstairs from making these collection binders, so we figured we'd give it a whirl. And in my cruising through the internet and reading and everything, I really didn't find videos that I thought encompassed everything that a new player or somebody like me that was familiar with TCGs but not so with FFTCG, I really didn't find videos that encapsulated everything from the top down. There's some great resources out there for FFTCG fans, and if you decide to get more involved in it, I definitely recommend checking them out. I'll include links below to a couple of my favorites, Josepher being one, the Crystal Tower being a podcast that's run, the Break Zone, a group of West Coast Bay-located teams that do a number of things for the tournament scene, and a ton of FFTCG content. And there's a lot out there. So I'll put a few links to a couple of my favorites if you want to get more involved. But what I intend to do with this initial series is to take the game step by step for brand new players. And it's going to assume that you're not even familiar with trading card games in general, defining terms that some of you more experienced players are obviously going to be familiar with, or just have other words for, but know exactly what they mean. So, if you can bear with me for some definitions, maybe there'll be something in here for those experienced or returning players too. Today's episode, we're going to get started with deck composition and card makeup, because to play FFTCG, you have to know about your deck and what you're allowed to put in it, and what the hell each of those cards do. So, let's get started. Alright, getting started, you're going to need a deck of Final Fantasy trading cards to play FFTCG. Imagine that, it's such a brain buster. And there's a few rules when you create a deck. First off, in most competitions, or in general play, the deck can be 50 cards exactly. No more, no less. There is an exception to this if you go to things like pre-release events or draft events that are usually side tournaments to bigger tournaments, where they'll hand you some booster packs and you tear them open and create a deck of anywhere from 40 to 50 cards. But outside of that, 50 cards, no more, no less. And if you want to get started quickly, the best way to do that is with a starter deck. Now, as of the recording of this video, we have seen 6 Opus sets released. So Opus 1 through 6, with 6 being the most recent, just came out a few weeks ago. We received starter decks in Opus 1, 3, and 5, so every odd set. We have another Opus set, number 7, coming out in November. We don't have too many details on that, but if history holds true, we should have a starter deck or two in there. Starter decks are going to run you anywhere from about $13 to $15 USD, depending on your local game store's prices or your favorite online retailer. With Opus 1, there were 3, and they were generally themed around a particular game. This one, of course, with Cloud on the front, being Final Fantasy VII. And you can see the elemental makeup of the deck by looking at the colored bars on the box. Also, reading the back will give you some general information as well. So this is a Final Fantasy VII themed starter deck that specializes in fire and earth cards, and all of your starter decks are going to be duo colored. There are going to be 2 elements in each deck. If you get into building your own deck, you are free to make up mono decks with only 1 element, stick to the duo format, create decks that aren't even based on elements. They have a little bit of everything. There's a ton of flexibility, but getting started, you're going to have a starter deck that has 2 colors in it, 2 elements represented, and some synergies between the cards that are in the deck already. So in Opus 1, you had the choice of Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy XIII, which was lightning and ice, and then Final Fantasy X, which was water and wind. So that represents all 6 elements available in Final Fantasy TCG. That's Earth, Wind, Lightning, Ice, Fire, and Water. There are 2 additional elements, Light and Dark, that have special rules tied to their cards. So we'll get to those later. In your Opus 1 boxes, whichever one you decide to go with, you're not going to get any light cards, so you won't even have to worry about it. If you're looking for something a little different, you have the boxes that came with Opus 3. Now, we had 2 starter decks for Opus 3, one based on Final Fantasy IX and one based on Final Fantasy Type 0. Again, duo elements, so 2 elements in each deck. Now, these did contain light cards. There was Ace in the Type 0 kit, and there was... I'm going to have to look up Zidane in the Final Fantasy IX kit. So the light and dark element rules would apply. So if you chose one of those decks, know that you're getting something a little different from the Opus 1 starting decks. Finally, with the Opus 5 release, we got 3 more starter decks. If you're searching online for these, the best keyword that I can recommend using in conjunction with FFTCG is the Starter Set 2018. All 3 of them were given that label, the 2018 starter sets. Again, duo elements, and we had Final Fantasy XIV this time, which was a favorite of mine and still is. Final Fantasy XII and Final Fantasy XIII get some representation again. No light or dark cards in these decks. However, there was a card type introduced in Opus 4 called Monsters, which was not present during Opus 1, 2, and 3. Thus, the 1 and 3 starter decks don't have monster cards in them. The Opus 5 decks do have monster cards in them. Not many, but a couple just to get you familiar with the card type. Now, it doesn't give you a huge game advantage or anything, but if you have a favorite game, my recommendation would be pick up a deck that corresponds to that game. You're going to know the characters, and you're going to laugh and smile while you're playing some of the cards or looking at some of the artwork. If you have a favorite element, then okay, stick to your favorite element. If none of those things really matter to you, I'd probably recommend picking up the Opus 5 boxes, simply so that you have one of each of the 4 card types in your hand. You'll have forwards, backups, and summons, which are available in all 3 sets of these decks, Opus 1, 3, and 5. But the Opus 5 ones will also include that 4th card type, Monster. So if you want every type of card available, grab one of the Opus 5 starter decks, the 2018 starter sets. They do come with the caveat, though, that if you get into it a little more, And Josepher has done a lot of content on trying to amp up starter decks for new players. The Opus 5 ones are a little challenging to do without getting into some of the rarer cards. But again, we're talking about just getting started. If you want all 4 card types, go with an Opus 5 set. Other than that, pick your favorite game or pick your favorite element or just grab a box at random. Get 2, one for you, one for your friend, and go to town. Each of those decks is going to contain 50 cards, so you'll automatically be abiding by that rule. They also are constructed in a way that no card is represented more than 3 times, to abide by another deck building rule, where you can only have the same card in a deck 3 times. 3 copies of any given card in your deck. Pretty easy rules. 50 cards, no more than 3 copies of any single card. Now, when I say no more than 3 copies of a card, I'm referring to the card's ID number. And when we get to card composition, I'll point that out to you where it is. That does not reference the card's name. For instance, in our Final Fantasy XIII Opus 5 starter deck and our Opus 1 starter deck, both based on Final Fantasy XIII, we may have characters that appear in both decks. But they're different cards. So they may be named Lightning, but they have different ID numbers. You could have 3 of each of those in your deck. The only exception is the recent Opus 6 releases started to have cards where they shared an ID number with a previously existing card. They were a reprint of an older card. So if they have both the new and the old number, then you've got to stick to just 3 copies. You can't take 3 from Opus 1 and 3 from Opus 6 that also have the Opus 1 ID number and add both of them to your deck. So a little bit of a caveat there, but that's a more recent thing, and with starter decks, you aren't really going to have to worry. Hell, with booster packs, unless you're buying Opus 6, you're not going to have to worry about that either. Also in your box, you're going to receive 2 things. One is the starter guide. Now, this is the older starter guide that I'm holding up here, but as far as what I'll be showing you in the videos, I'll be using the newer ones. So when you open yours up and you see starter guide in the corner here, if you see a bomb card showing as one of the descriptions, you'll know you're looking at a more recent starter guide. Again, those will be the ones from Opus 5, since those were monster cards. The other thing you will receive is a field, a play mat. Now, it's nothing fancy. It's just a cheap piece of paper to give you the play mat and where everything's going to go when we actually start playing. I would recommend for your first few games that you do use it, actually. And not so much for where things go. That's pretty basic, and there's not a ton of things going on the field here. But I would recommend using it because in the lower right-hand or the lower left-hand corner when you're looking at it, you'll see the turn order and the different phases and what you're allowed to do. So it'll be a nice reminder as you get set in your pattern of play on what comes next and what you're allowed to do during each phase. Once you've played a few times, you'll probably toss that baby out. Now that we've talked about getting a deck, what a deck is made up of, and what the rules are on some of the things you can put in a deck, let's take a look at the 4 card types we're going to be using to play FFTCG. All right, here we go. The name of the game in FFTCG is to do 7 damage to your opponent. If you do 7 damage to your opponent before they do 7 damage to you, you win. The other way to win is to force your opponent, or just have your opponent naturally not be able to draw a card when they're required to do so. So on their turn, during their draw phase, if they try to draw a card and they are out of cards to do so, then they've decked out and they lose the game. You can also use this to your advantage if you see that they have an empty draw pile by playing something that might force them to draw a card, in which case they can't do so, and you win the game there because they decked out again. Using those 3 ways to win, we're going to take our deck and cater it to how we want to play to achieve one of those 3 goals, or maybe go after a couple of them. We do that with 4 different card types. The primary damage dealers in FFTCG are your forwards. These are your brutes, the grunts that are going to do the work, trying to take out the forwards on the other side of the board and get through to the player to deal those 7 points of damage. So let's take a look first at the forwards. We're going to use the Warrior of Light example. And again, if you're following along with a starter guide, I'm referencing the cards that are actually in there to make it easier for you to watch this video and reference the sheet at the same time. Our Warrior of Light is a forward, as denoted a little more than halfway down the card on the left-hand side by the word forward. This is also on other cards where you will see backup, monster, or summon. So it's very easy to tell which type of card you're dealing with when you're looking at it in your hand. Now, card composition is similar across all four, so I'll spend a little more time here on the Warrior of Light, pointing out some details that are universal to all card types. For instance, in the upper left-hand corner of the card, you see a number overlapping a colored crystal. This denotes the cost of the card to get it onto the field or to use it in some way. Our Warrior of Light has a 2 cost, meaning we will need 2 crystal points to cast this card or play this card on the field, depending on whatever card type it might be. We'll get to how to get crystal points when we actually get to gameplay in our next episode, but just know that for this particular card, our Warrior of Light, we will need 2 crystal points, often referred to as CP. The red crystal behind the 2 denotes the element of the card, in this case, fire. So when we generate those 2 CP to cast Warrior or to bring Warrior of Light onto the field, at least one of those has to be fire. Now, they could all be fire, or if it was a casting cost of 5, I still only need 1 fire. That doesn't matter. I need 2 crystal points, and 1 must be fire, in this case, to bring Warrior of Light onto the field. Just to the right of that, you see the card's name. In this case, Warrior of Light. Now, this is important because other cards may give you the ability to go search for Warrior of Light, in which case you could go into your deck and find any card named Warrior of Light, the one we're looking at, or another Warrior of Light card that you also had in your deck. We point that out because there are a lot of things that not only search for things in deck, but also impact those cards. Maybe you have a card that buffs Warrior of Light to make them stronger if they're on the field. This card would be eligible as a target for that. Now, you don't see this on the Warrior of Light card, but in the name bar all the way on the right, after the name, we see nothing for the Warrior of Light. But that's not always going to be the case. We might see an EX, indicating an EX or X burst. And that's a special ability that is triggered when you take damage. We'll get to that to gameplay. Just notice that Warrior of Light is not an X-Burst. We also are missing an icon that shows 3 overlapping cards. This one's important, and we need to cover it briefly. If a card has that 3 overlapping icon, it means you can play as many of them on the field as you want at any time. So you can have multiple copies of them down at the same time. The Warrior of Light doesn't have that icon, which means we can only play 1 Warrior of Light on the field at a time. Not just 1 copy of this particular Warrior of Light, but any card named Warrior of Light in our deck can't come out onto the field until this one leaves. Whether it's destroyed through combat, we do something to forcibly remove it from the field ourselves because we want to play a different Warrior of Light or a new Warrior of Light. Our opponent casts a summon that gets rid of it. Anything that'll take it off the field would free up that slot and we can put a Warrior of Light on the field. So if you don't see that 3 overlapping cards icon, you can only have 1 card of that name out at a time. If you see it, you can put as many copies out as you want. Continuing on, looking at the card, we've already pointed out where you can find out if it's a forward, backup, or summon, or monster. But just to the right of that in the same bar, you'll see the word Warrior. That denotes this card's job. Again, just like the card's name, this is an important factor. We might have cards that make all warriors stronger. In this case, all job class or job warrior stronger. And that would apply to our Warrior of Light. We might have a card that makes all job ninjas stronger. Well, if where it says Warrior on this card it said Ninja, this card would be buffed by that target. Further to the right on that bar, we have the category of the card, and this typically denotes the version of Final Fantasy, what Final Fantasy game it came from. In this one, we see two. We see DFF for Dissidia Final Fantasy, we see a dash, and then we see a 1. Again, just like the name of the card at the top and the job in the center, category is also a term that could be used on other cards to search for a Category 1 card. All Category 1 cards gain 1,000 power, etc. So you have to be aware of these categories and able to reference them when needed. The one thing I will point out here that isn't clear in a lot of places, Warrior of Light is actually 3 categories. DFF, 1, and DFF 1. Now, generally, as far as the meta and the cards go now, you're not going to need all of those. But it is important to know that any category that's separated by a dash is actually in both of those categories and is in a third category that is the full title. So some of these things I'm going to give you right now don't exist, but in theory, that means if a card allowed you to search for 1 DFF forward in your hand, search for 1 Category 1 forward in your hand, or in your deck, or search for 1 forward Category DFF1 in your deck, all 3 of those would allow you to go to your deck and search out this particular Warrior of Light forward. If there's no dash in there, however, it only belongs to that 1 category. Under that bar, we see the card's ability, if it has any. Now, this can be an auto ability, something that automatically happens when a certain trigger is satisfied, such as entering the field. It could be an action ability, where there is a cost associated with performing some type of action, and if we pay that cost, we get to perform that action. It could be a field ability, or it could be a special ability, denoted by an orange name on the ability, and usually a cost associated, which we'll cover later. The text here indicates everything that this card may be able to do at different times, and while we're not going to cover each type of ability in detail in this video, I just wanted to point out where it is. Also of special note here, if you happen to have any issues with color blindness, so that you can't see in the upper left-hand corner the color of the crystal behind the number, you'll notice behind the ability text, there is a mark, a logo, in this case of flames, that is universal. So you can look at the logo to determine the card's element if you have certain issues with certain colors. The last thing we're going to review on this particular card is in the lower right-hand corner, and this applies to forwards only. This is a number denoting power, in which case we have the Warrior of Light at 5,000 power. Now, unlike other trading card games you might have played where there's a power and a health, or 2 or multiple numbers on a card, this singular power number indicates both for Final Fantasy forwards. So 5,000 is the strength which the Warrior of Light swings when he attacks or is blocking, and it also denotes how much damage the Warrior of Light can sustain before they will be moved to the break zone or the discard pile. So it's important to denote that that number references power. Anything that does damage hurts the card, and if damage exceeds power, it moves to the break zone. The card is destroyed. We'll talk more about that later, because there are situations that allow those 2 numbers to change. Moving on to the second card type we're going to talk about is backups, and we can start to move a little bit faster here because you'll notice a lot of the elements are the same. The upper left-hand corner has a cost. In this case, Raubon costs 4 CP, or crystal points, one of which needs to be yellow or earth. Raubon's title is in the top, and to the right of his title, we don't see the 3-card icon, so we can only have 1 Raubon backup out on the field at a time. We do see the EX for X-Burst, though. When you take damage in FFTCG, you denote that damage by taking the top card of your deck, turning it face up, and putting it in the damage zone on your field. collect 7 cards there, and you lose. X-bursts are a little perk. When you take damage, if the card you put in the damage zone happens to be an X-burst, you get to do the X-burst ability written in the ability box on this card for free. So it's a little game swing, a little random element added when you take in damage. In the middle of the card, we see that this is a backup. The job is Flame General, and the category is 14. All items we might need to know about when we start talking about interactions between other cards. We have our action text. Now, when casting this card, paying the 4 CP, and putting Raubon on the field, we would get to do this ability. The EX burst just denotes that if this card actually went to the damage zone from our deck, never came to our hand, we also would get to do this same ability. We would just get to do it for free in that case. We wouldn't have to pay to put Raubon on the field and get the benefit of that ability. An important note about backups is that you can only have 5 on your board at any time, and it doesn't matter what their names are. If you want to put different backups out after you have 5, you need to find a way to break or destroy your own backups, or hope that your opponent destroys or breaks one of your backups to free up a slot. Forwards don't play by that rule. You can, and will probably want to, have as many forwards out as you can at a time. Moving on to monster cards, we see that our bomb example of a monster card has a 2 CP cost, one of which has to be fire. The name is bomb, and we see for the first time in our examples the triple overlapping card icon, indicating that we could have multiple bombs out at a time if we wanted. We also see, right under the artwork, that this is a monster. The job is bomb, and its category. So we have all of the searching items that we need to make sure all of the interactions between cards, we know what they apply to and when they don't. Now, monsters rely a little bit on their action ability text, more so than other cards. While it is important on all cards, it's more so on monsters because they are simply defined by what their abilities are. They don't have power, as indicated in the lower right-hand corner by there not being a power number. But there are instances, like this example, where we can turn them into forwards and they might have power temporarily. They may do totally other different things. So monster cards are something you're going to have to look at and read the text to make sure, is this a card that works well in my deck? The final card type we have is summons, and in this example, we're going to use the wind summon Alexander. In the upper left-hand corner, we're repeating ourselves. See? It gets easier. You just got to do it once or twice. Trust me. In the upper left-hand corner, we see that we need 4 crystal points, one of which needs to be green or wind. We see that the card name is Alexander, and we also see that this is an X-burst. So if we took damage and had to draw a card off of our draw pile and flip it face up in the damage zone to mark that damage, boom, X-burst, we would get to perform the action for free. In this case, the X-burst is to choose one forward of cost 5 or more and break it. So if they've got a power forward on the board, this would be a great card to pop as an X-burst because you don't even have to spend the 4 CP to get it. But getting an X-burst to pop like that does come with the downside of you had to take damage. Notice a key difference here. Summons don't have jobs. There is no job in the center of the card between the word summon and its category on the far right. All right, that's going to conclude episode 1 here. So we've covered your deck, the rules in creating the deck, the 4 cards that make up a deck, and all the information on a card, where it can be found, and what it references. If you've enjoyed this episode, let me know in the comments below, and if you have feedback on something that I can do a little better for you as a new player, or questions, put them in there as well. I'll be sure to answer as many of them as I can. In episode 2, we'll move on to setting up the field and actually playing around, so that you can see how to get a card on the field, and we'll do some basic combat examples. We'll finish that up with a few more episodes that actually show a few rounds going back and forth, uninterrupted by me explaining anything, and then we'll start tackling some more advanced concepts like priority and the stack. I just said 2 words that experienced players hate trying to teach new players. but we'll get through it, and we'll have a lot of fun doing it. I hope you enjoyed it. This is Magic Man saying, I'll see you next time on the FFTCG How to Play, Episode 2.